windstorm for the history books means anger and frustration from the last customers to have power restored. Why was it so bad? And how do we stay plugged in the future? DTE Chief Jerry Anderson is here. And she's overseen a long list of power pack prosecutions, from a corrupt mayor to dangerous airbags. Barbara McQuade is here to talk about moving on. Today is Sunday, March 19, 2017, and this is Flashpoint. Hi, welcome to Flashpoint, and happy to say we're into the last full day of winter. Spring starts tomorrow morning at exactly 6:28 a.m. Now, of course, here that doesn't necessarily mean much. Some of our biggest snowstorms over the years have been springtime affairs, and more strange weather ahead would be in keeping with what we've had so far. A very mild winter that included, of course, a historic windstorm that was oddly just wind. No thunderstorms, no snow squalls around it, just wind clocking in at near hurricane force levels. And it turned the region's electrical wiring into a tangled mess of high voltage ramen. Now, DTE was quick to point out that it was the second worst storm-related outage they've ever had. But for some, it was a week without power just as the weather was turning much colder. And in the age of social media, those frustrations spilled out all over Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and Twitter. And we heard frustrations too. The newsrooms in town dutifully covered the efforts to get the power back up and running and the hardships endured by those waiting in the dark. But some suggested that we were going too easy on DTE. Now, that raises some interesting questions about expectations. We just expect the power to be there when we flip the switch. We all pay every month to make that happen. But just how much is that to ask? The chairman and CEO of DTE, Jerry Anderson, is here. And we're going to sit down this morning with the now former U.S. Attorney in Detroit, Barbara McQuade. It is part of a political life. New president, new appointees, and that means U.S. attorneys, which were ushered out en masse last week. But as McQuade heads to the law school at the University of Michigan, it is worth looking back at an extraordinary string of high-profile and high-impact cases. The Kwame Kilpatrick corruption case, the underwear bomber, Dr. Fareed Fata, Takata airbags, Volkswagen. She's here this morning to talk about what she did and if she's leaving anything undone. It's all this morning on Flashpoint. It was a week ago last Wednesday that the winds started to howl, and by the time they were done, nearly 1 million DTE customers were without power. That's homes, so you're talking about millions of people being affected. It was much more than an inconvenience for many of them. Let's talk about it this morning with the chairman and CEO of DTE, Jerry Anderson. Jerry, good to have you back on Flashpoint.
Great to be here.
And I already stand corrected. I said at the outset, because we had been told in the middle of it that it was the second worst storm-related outage, and now it's the worst by far, you were telling me.
Worst by far. So weather forecasters talk about 100-year storms. This is by far the worst thing we've seen in our 100-year-plus history.
On that day, when the winds finally were starting to subside a little bit and you could look at what I'm curious as to what the screens looked like in front of you and as you tried to assess the enormity of the problem.
So the picture came together faster because we've invested in smart meters, and those started to light up and create a picture. What was unique here is that we essentially had a Class 1 hurricane that lasted for 12 hours. So we had high winds, 70-mile-an-hour peaks. Typically, we get a wave of damage and then it stops. We had wave after wave after wave. And when it all stopped late Wednesday night, we had 800,000 customers, nearly 40% of our customers. We had 10,000 cases of downed wires, 1,100 broken utility poles. We had 20,000 cases of individual customers or small groups of customers who were out. It was an enormous amount of damage.
You also then had, because this was the case at our house, and I know from our anecdotal evidence here at the station, we had people who lost their power maybe 24 hours after the storm had blown through. What was that about?
So it could have been a couple of things. We had a very fragile state out there. So in some cases, winds the next day toppled a tree or took down a branch that caused an outage. In some cases, we had to take a circuit out in order to safely do the repairs. So it could have been either of those.
So when we've got this many different problems, I'm curious as to how you go about prioritizing, because so far I'm picturing we've all had that, we've got one bulb out on the Christmas tree trying to wade our way through, trying to figure out where the problem is, but you've got lots of bulbs out. And how do you now figure out where you start and who gets back online first?
Yeah. So as I said, the smart meters helped because we could see those 800,000 bulbs that were out in the layout of that.
For just an aside here, before smart meters, you had to rely much more on people calling in and tell you their power was out?
Yeah, they had to call us by phone, and then our people had to populate those phone calls to addresses and slowly try to piece it together. So big help from technology. But once we had the picture pieced together, we knew it was huge, although we still have to send out damage assessors to see just how bad it is. And what we found was terrible. The first order of business is to cover downed wires to make sure that we don't deal with public safety issues.
And we did have some fires break out because of that, yeah.
We did. The second order of business is to get to the most vulnerable. So we have a list of customers who are elderly or in some other way vulnerable, maybe on a medical machine. We called them all. If we couldn't reach them, we sent people door to door. So that, along with assessing the situation, was much of day one. Day two, we started in with 16-hour days with 3,000 men in the field, 1,800 linemen, 1,000 men with chainsaws, a couple hundred men assessing damage out there. And they went to work, and within 2 days, by Friday evening, we had 70% of the customers back. 2 more 16-hour days later, we had 95% of the customers back.
Somebody's always going to be last. And that's where the frustrations come in.
That is the painful part of this, both for us and for them, because you're right, that's where the work gets tough and slow.
I want to go back to these people whose lives depend on electricity, people who've got medical equipment that has to be run by power. It's incumbent on them to make sure that you at DTE know that they've got that in their home? Is that how you create this sort of priority list?
Yeah, we create a list, and we would ask everyone, especially after an event like this, if you know somebody who's in that situation, make sure they're on our list.
Yeah.
If you think they might not be, call us, and we will put them in touch with 211. We worked extensively with the United Way, the Red Cross, and the faith-based community to reach out to those vulnerable to make sure we had them covered. But the best way is to make sure they're on our list.
So I'm curious about your view on the social media world in a moment like this. Helpful to help sort of wind your way around and figure out who's still in need of help, or did it drive you crazy to be kind of the target of an awful lot of spears?
You know, it doesn't drive me crazy because I get it. It's frustrating. Yeah. So much depends on electricity, and if you're out for a week, it's hard, and we get that. You know, what we deal with in that last 5% is often individual customers or maybe a group of a half dozen customers who have intense damage. So let me give you an example. We had one case of a school and one block of customers that required 16 men, 16 hours to replace 5 broken poles in order to put a handful of people back in. Out in Lapeer County, we had 30 individual cases of a single home out that had a broken utility pole that needed to be replaced before they could be brought back. Yeah. Those tend to be the people who come back last, and it's slow, but look, I understand it's frustrating, and we empathize.
Frustrating because in our modern world, we rely on, think of how many things you plug in every day to charge and to run your entire house. So that's one part of this, but you know, I had a number of people say, why are we still leaving ourselves so vulnerable to wind? Why is everything still up in the air? How do you explain that?
In terms of undergrounding, yeah, to underground our electric system is enormously expensive. So we underground portions of it. In most subdivisions today, the wires go underground for the last few hundred feet or so. But the utility bills would be many multiples of what they are today if we undergrounded the whole system. And that's true across the country, so you generally don't see it.
Well, we've got an awful lot of conversation right now about our aging infrastructure, and that includes, of course, the grid. And I'm curious as to your thoughts now as we electrify more and more, including vehicles, how our grid is equipped to handle this, and also the security of that grid, which I think has become such a big issue.
Yeah, it's an important topic. But we are investing a lot in the grid now and will be in the future. Tree trimming, so 85% of what just happened to us was trees. The soil was soft and wet, early thaw, and a lot of big trees.
Weird winter helped all this, no doubt.
Yeah. So tree trimming in a way that works for communities. The second is grid hardening. So we built our grid a long time ago. It's time to fundamentally strengthen and replace, and that helps with reliability. The third is technology. Smart grid people talk about, it's very real. So these smart meters really help, but we've got to get thousands of sensors out on our system that can send us information. We can also automate the grid so that we can actually use computer algorithms to do self-healing with the grid, that it will open and reclose circuits and isolate automatically to where the problem is. But it takes investment to get there, and we're working our way through those investments.
How vulnerable is it, though, to a bad actor?
To cybersecurity, for example? There's two...
Pretty easy to see just from what happened over our week without power.
What it means.
What it means.
There are two sectors that the federal government's especially focused on. One is banking, and one is ours, for obvious reasons. And so we're in constant communication with both industry and federal authorities on the latest threat, the latest defenses. We put a lot of energy into that. We also protect against physical attack, because it isn't only the cyber world that can go after our assets. And so tremendous amount of work going into making sure that our dispersed physical infrastructure is protected.
Last thing I wanted to ask you is about the way that you're making your electricity. As you know, I'm a big fan of electric vehicles. I've talked quite a bit about my experience with the Volt. But to your way of thinking, I think that you would argue that you can make electricity and send it to me as electric power far more efficiently than I can take fuel out of a pump and put it into my combustion engine.
Well, that's true, and I think that'll be an evolution over time. So, look, we're changing fundamentally the way we produce electricity. Coal was the backbone of our country for a long time. It's not going to be in the future. We're going to.
How far away is that?
We're transitioning now. We announced the shutdown of 11 coal-fired units, and we'll have 60% of it retired within 10 to 15 years, and the rest will follow. And that'll be replaced by renewables and natural gas, which are much lower emitting, both conventional emissions and carbon. So we'll, over time, take 80–90% of the carbon out of our emissions. And if that's feeding an automobile, it does the same for the automobile. And it's going to take time to get there, but we can get there and do it affordably.
My last question, are you concerned, as somebody then who's thinking about renewable energy, are you concerned about the change at the EPA to now have an EPA secretary who seems to question man-made climate change?
So much of what we're going to do in the future is cast already because of the age of our infrastructure. One thing I've said is that a change of administration can't turn a 70-year-old coal plant into a 30-year-old coal plant. They're old. It's time to move on to new, more modern infrastructure. And so we're going to do that.
Jerry, good to have you here. I always enjoy our conversations.
I do as well.
Thanks. Jerry Anderson from DTE. When we come back, Barbara McQuade moving on as the U.S. Attorney for Detroit, heading to U of M, but what a run it's been. We'll talk to her about that on Flashpoint after this. Welcome back. Saying goes, elections have consequences, and that is certainly true for the many who serve at the pleasure of the president, the many appointees who find themselves looking for a new job when there's a change in the White House. And so it goes for Barbara McQuade, who is U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan, presided over an eye-popping caseload over the past 7 years. Very good to have now former U.S. Attorney, as you turned in your resignation this past week, Barbara McQuade. Barbara, good to have you back here.
Thanks. Devin.
I'm curious first with this, there was a lot of hullabaloo over the changes. This is typical. This is what happens when there's a new president.
It is, absolutely. You know, it's customary for new presidents to choose their own U.S. attorneys. I think the one thing that was surprising was it was very abrupt.
Quickly.
Typically, you're asked to hold over until there can be an orderly transition and a successor is identified. And this was, Friday at 4:30, leave immediately. So that part was a little bit disruptive. But other than that, I had no expectations that I could stay forever, and so it's not unexpected.
A lot of attention on the U.S. Attorney in New York, Preet Bharara, who I'm just curious as to whether you have any thoughts about, because he refused to resign because he felt that the president had asked him to stay when he was the president-elect.
Yeah, so I don't know what all happened there. I know there was a public announcement that he was going to stay, and then suddenly he wasn't. So I can understand why he might have been confused and wanted clarity on his situation. But, when the president asks you to resign, my feeling is it's time to go.
It's time to go. You, however, believe with a lot of things that are no doubt in the works in your office. You leave, but generally everybody else in the office stays, correct?
Yes, everybody else is a career prosecutor. We have 115 career prosecutors in the office, and so I'm confident they will continue with the great work that we've been doing, and the cases and investigations that are ongoing will continue to go.
We have covered a number of those that are continuing, and you would expect those to continue to be prosecuted. I want to go back. A lot of people have been talking about sort of your greatest hits here. It's been a Barbara McQuade, This Is Your Life kind of week. But I'm curious as to, for all the talk that we've in the media talked about with the Kwame Kilpatrick case, the Volkswagen, Takata, all these very headline-grabbing cases, I'm wondering if there are some of those that you believe were actually pretty important that didn't get as much attention as those other cases?
Well, maybe a couple categories. You know, we tried to use the resources of the U.S. Attorney's Office to improve the quality of life for the people of the Eastern District of Michigan, not just prosecute whatever cases came along. So a couple very important cases involved theft of trade secrets. One case from Ford, one from General Motors, and we prosecuted people who stole very valuable intellectual property information from those companies. Former
employees trying to take off with stuff.
Exactly. You know, one involving electrical systems, one involving hybrid technology, and so you know, the thought is that by prosecuting those cases, we can deter others from committing those same kinds of crimes.
Well, that's a good place for me to ask you about a very growing concern for a lot of Americans, and that is your ability to scrutinize my life, to dig into what I may have in my email or my computer at home, on and on and on. Versus my right to privacy. How do you balance that?
That's a really tricky issue, and in fact, that's a very topic I want to be teaching at Michigan Law School. We live in such interesting times, but you know, there are really strong competing values on both sides. One is the need for public safety and to find people who are maybe plotting a terrorist attack. On the other hand, our right to privacy, and so all of those things are really difficult. And as technology evolves, those things become really gray. Certainly, the founders of our country, who wrote the Constitution, never imagined being able to look at your email because it didn't exist. And so, you know, the Fourth Amendment talks about unreasonable searches and seizures. And so that word unreasonable is what is subject to interpretation in changing times.
Where would you have been in prosecuting Kwame Kilpatrick had it not been for a mountain of incriminating text messages?
They were the key to the case, I believe, because although we did have witnesses who could testify about what had happened, it was really important to have corroborating evidence in those cases, and the text messages really did confirm what the witnesses were saying. So I think that's what made the case so strong against him. So it was really important. Now, we got a search warrant for those text messages, but again, that is part of that balance. Where do we want to draw those legal lines about where the government is permitted to take your private communications and where it's not?
I once told Kwame Kilpatrick that the only reason that a lot of us started covering his situation, his problems, the way that we did was because he fired Gary Brown. We all knew about the rumors about the party at, I'll keep putting that in air quotes, the party at the mansion. None of us in the mainstream anyway were willing to put it on the record until he fired Gary Brown, and he put it, and that put it on the record because that was what Gary Brown was investigating. But I'm curious as to how much all of that that we were focused on at the time really had to do with his downfall versus deeper matters that we didn't know at the time.
Well, the corruption matters that we were investigating are really apart from all of that, but they did intersect when it came to the text messages, because it was when those were exposed as part of the Gary Brown case that we became aware that they existed. And although our case was still strong without them, they became even stronger once we had them, and I think made it really a very strong case for a jury to be able to see that corroborating, objective, independent evidence.
I also think that, I suppose, while a lot of us were focused on the more salacious things, maybe we should have been spending more time looking at the swaps deal that he had put together with Wall Street that ended up helping push the city, I won't say into bankruptcy, but more quickly into bankruptcy.
Yeah, well, you know, that's investigators look at things not necessarily looking for that which is exciting, but looking for criminal activity, and I'm grateful that they do.
Of all the cases that you were a part of, the one that I just found most mind-boggling, really, of all of them, was Dr. Fareed Fata, a doctor who managed to convince a lot of people that they had these horrible conditions that he could then treat to enrich himself when they were healthy, maybe completely healthy. Your reflections on that case?
It was a really extraordinary case because although we've prosecuted many doctors for healthcare fraud, fraudulent billing to Medicare, this one involved real patient harm where he lied to people about having cancer. Yeah. I think so many of us have been touched by cancer in one way or another with a family member.
Everybody.
And the idea that you would lie to somebody about having that is really horrific. But you know, even those who were relieved to find out that they did not, in fact, have cancer, many still had permanent damage like nerve damage, organ organ damage.
From the treatment.
Loss of teeth
right.
from chemotherapy, which is poison that's put in your body and that a doctor and a patient choose to do to kill cancer cells when that's in the best interest of the patient. When you don't have cancer, it's just poison.
I'm curious as to your thoughts in general about public corruption. If we go back to Kilpatrick, but also we've watched investigations in Macomb County. Is there a ton of public corruption going on that we really can't quite get our arms around enough to prosecute because so much of it is very casually done without a whole lot of paper trail? Or do you feel like it's fairly infrequent?
I still believe it's infrequent. I think most public officials are honest and honorable. But I think one of the things that's changed the game a little bit is we've gotten better at catching them because of the electronic paper trail that people leave through text messages and emails and credit cards and even gift cards. And so I think that technology has enabled us to be a little better at catching those involved in corrupt schemes.
I don't want to ask you to spill something on somebody that you don't think you had much on, because that wouldn't be very ethical. That would be rather slanderous. But I'm curious as to whether there were some fish that you don't feel like you got in the boat that you wish that you could have during your tenure.
No, the decisions that we make are based on, do we have enough to make a provable case with a reasonable likelihood of success at trial based on evidence. And we brought those cases where we thought we had the proof that we could do, and if we can't prove a case, then a person is not guilty and we shouldn't be charging them.
You're headed to U of M now to teach, which you've lived in Ann Arbor, so that works out pretty well. But I'm curious because there were a lot of people like me who like to talk politics a lot, who speculated that there might be something political in your future. Might there still be, or is that something that really doesn't interest or attract you?
Maybe someday. I want to encourage good people to run for public office. It's something that we need in this country, but I have long prided myself on being a public servant, but I don't know that I'm a politician. Those are two sort of different things. And
did you find your job being more political occasionally than you wanted it to be?
No, my job really allowed me to be independent, and that's one of the things I loved about it. I never had to worry about political wins. I could do what I thought was right and never had to worry about doing what was popular.
How do you suppose then that your tenure, will your tenure be remembered for this extraordinary string that I seem to think that it was, or is this, do you think, how most U.S. attorneys' tenures go?
I don't know. I'm really proud of the work that the people in our office did during the time that I was there. Yeah. And I hope that to the extent there is a legacy, it is that people will see government as being capable of being effective and being able to improve the quality of life.
Barbara McQuade, really good to have you back on Flashpoint, and hopefully we'll talk. We'll be using you now as a legal analyst, I suppose, at U of M. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks, Dan.
Some final thoughts when we come back. This is Flashpoint on Local 4. One more note on Barbara McQuade. In this age of neither confirm nor deny, she did confirm to me that her office continues to investigate the Flint water crisis, and she is confident that that investigation will continue even in her departure. Thanks for being here. Meet the Press coming up next right after Mitch Albom's Heart of Detroit. We'll see you next week on Flashpoint.